So if you are visiting and wondering who I am and why my chair is blocking all the good exit and entrance out of the altar, I should say that I'm the bishop, and this is my second visit to Emmanuel, and I'm delighted to be back because on behalf of the, depends how you count, 20,000 or 30,000 other Episcopalians in the state of Rhode Island, I want to say thank you. Thank you for all that you have been doing for the diocese. Thank you for your generosity in paying your assessment and allowing us to start new congregations and try new things. We have a new congregation forming in Coventry. We have a new congregation forming in Pasco. We have a new congregation forming in the women's prison, as a matter of fact. The Amazing Grace congregation that I think you all prayed for a few weeks ago, if you use the diocesan cycle. And we have more coming, God willing. And as we try to reopen the cathedral and find a mission for that, all of that is being made possible because of your generosity and your faithfulness, and most importantly, your prayers. So on behalf of everybody else around the state, thank you for all you're doing here at Emmanuel. And while I'm saying thank you, let me say thank you to your clergy, Vicar Joan and Father Richard. They are wonderful colleagues, and I am delighted to be able to work beside them. I'm especially delighted to have stolen Vicar Joan away from the Diocese of Easton and have gotten her here. You did most of the stealing, but I helped a little bit. And we are delighted. I had a chance to be with people who knew her before, and they all wanted to know how she's doing and how she's fitting in. And I was able to say, splendidly. So, thank you, both of you. And while I'm saying thank you, I'll finish by saying thank you to Grace, who is here just to this year. I'm sorry, I've been lobbied hard to keep her here long term, but I have need of her, and maybe she'll be back, but maybe she won't. She is preparing to be ordained a deacon. God willing, in a year's time, she and her classmates will begin their ministry as deacons in the diocese. My sense is we need about 35 deacons in the diocese. We have about 6 active deacons right now. So we got work to do. And perhaps God is calling you to take a tourist view of the state of Rhode Island. And maybe you want to think about that yourself. I'm sure Grace or Joan will be glad to talk to you about either of those things. Oh. We are in the 5th Sunday of Lent. Can you believe it? Next week is Palm Sunday, the Sunday of the Passion Liturgy, and the week after that is Easter, and then, wow, we're off to the races. Because the plants will, all the snow will go away, the sun will come out, the plants will come up, the Volvo International races are coming. Oh, it's going to be such a fun. It's going to be great. But we have to get through these next couple of weeks first. And having made this journey through Lent, this is really the last Sunday we have a chance to talk about what's going to happen over the next 2 weeks. Because next week, with the Palm Sunday liturgy and then the reading of the Passion, those words are so powerful that it's hard to pull ourselves back and ask ourselves, what is actually going on in this? And then at Easter, it's just such a wonderful celebration of God's surprising victory that we don't really remember the pain at that point. Like a woman who's been through childbirth, you don't remember the pain, I'm told. I haven't done it. But you remember the joy of holding your newborn child in your arms. We forget on Easter the pain of Palm Sunday. We forget the pain of Holy Week. But I think all of us who are going through Holy Week, all of us who hear Jesus talking about his own death, his crucifixion, find ourselves wondering why this has to happen. Why is it that Jesus came into the world to die? He clearly did that. He was preparing his disciples all along, but it was a very difficult thing to hear. The great climactic moment of Mark's Gospel is the moment when Peter confesses that Jesus is the Messiah. No one has understood it to that point. No human has understood it to that point. Peter says it, and Jesus says what to him? You are right, and I must be crucified. And Peter says, what? No. And Jesus says, shut up. I think that's almost an exact quote. At least the way I translate the Greek. It's hard to understand. And you can see again and again in the Bible, again and again in the Gospels, people struggling to get their heads wrapped around what this means. And I'd like to tell you that after the crucifixion and after the resurrection, we all now know exactly what was going on. But we don't. We don't. We haven't. We have not found the answer yet. There are multiple answers floating in the Bible. There are multiple answers floating in the history of the church. The first answer that people came up with early on in the beginning was a very philosophical answer. That Jesus, who is the light of the world, Jesus, who is the vine that gives us life, was taken into the place of shadow and darkness where there was no hope and no light. And the paradox happened that when you put any light in the darkness, the light will always overcome the darkness. That which was death could not contain life. And so the gates of hell were burst, and everyone was able to issue forth into a new relationship with God. That was a pretty good explanation. That worked for about 1,000 years. And then people thought, I'm not so sure about that one. Anselm came along. We like Anselm. He was an Archbishop of Canterbury. Yay! And Anselm was trying to understand this as well, and he put this whole story in the sort of medieval liege lord language that made sense to the people at that time, which was that a great debt was owed to God because we had turned against God, and God had a right to expect someone to pay that debt. And yet you and I were not capable of paying that debt. So Jesus came, made the sacrifice on our behalf, and because of that sacrifice, we have been forgiven. That language worked wonderfully for about 1,000 years. But it stopped making sense in the 19th century. It really did. And so people still have it. You hear it in our prayers. You see it in our prayer book along with the other explanation. But it started to go away. And people came up with other explanations. The two modern explanations, have you ever studied Alfred Whitehead's process philosophy? Well, you should. It's really great. It's actually at the basis of quantum physics, too. So it's double awesome. There's an answer for that. And then my own personal favorite is the theological writings of René Girard and a Girardian analysis of the power imbalance. That's good, too. But he mostly writes in French, so it's hard to read. But there's another one floating out there, which actually makes sense according to John's Gospel. And it's an understanding of what the crucifixion is about that has its roots in the writing of St. Augustine of Hippo. And you see it most fulsomely in the writings of Peter Abelard, a medieval theologian. And it's the idea that Jesus came to show us what we could become. And in the action of the crucifixion and the resurrection, we are being shown how we are expected to live our lives so that we can be little Christs, Christians, in the world. It's a very powerful image. And you hear it also. Don't be worried that we don't know the answer, by the way, because there really isn't one answer to anything that is connected with God. You will find, I hope, in your life, as you get older and you grow deeper in your faith, that there are multiple answers to anything that you ask about God. And sometimes one answer works, and sometimes another answer works, but they all are true. It's just like the parables. There's never one real answer to what a parable means. There are multiple meanings, and sometimes one will work for you, and sometimes another. Don't be scandalized by this. This is actually where we are moving in our own lives, in our own philosophy, as we move into the 21st century. This idea that multiple things can be true at the same time. Something we in physics know very well, oddly enough, and the rest of the world is catching up to us. Aha! So what is Jesus doing? Jesus is saying, I must be lifted up so that I can draw the whole world to myself. I must be raised up on that cross so that the whole world can see who God is, understand why it is that I came into this world, and the whole world, having known that, will follow me. There's an old saying in the church, the seed of the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Have you ever heard that before? The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. You can see how this works. Do you remember those 21 men who were killed recently in Libya because of their faith? Who were marched off on that beach and horribly murdered? There was within a week the most beautiful icon that appeared in the Coptic churches. And they had called them the 21 martyrs of Libya. And the whole church was strengthened by the witness of these people who, even at the point of death, refused to deny that Jesus Christ was Lord. By paying that price, they were able to confess something profound to all of us. It is that great moment that Christ is prefiguring on the cross that, God willing, you and I will never have to face. Do not seek martyrdom, but when the moment comes, be ready to do what you have to do to testify. What do I mean, do not seek? Well, because seeking for martyrdom can take you into a place that actually God's not calling you to do. Jim Annan. Don't even recognize that name? Jim Annan. He was, for a long time, the rector of Christ Church in Westerly. I'm getting older, so I'm finding less and less people know that name. I knew Jim 27 years ago when he was the dean at Yale Divinity School, Berkeley Divinity School, where I studied for the priesthood. Jim once said to us as incoming students, "Would you quit saying to me, 'I'll die if I don't become a priest'?" Quit saying that, because I'd really rather you didn't become a priest then. You don't need to be that way about your sense of call. You need to be disciplined, you need to be answering, but you don't need to be so dramatic. What you need to know is if you don't become a priest, your life will go on, and you'll find something else to do with your life. In fact, he encouraged all of us in seminary to have a backup plan. My backup plan was to be a high school physics teacher or to be a college physics teacher. One of those two things. I figured I could probably find work somewhere, and if this priest thing didn't work out, I had a way out. Knowing that I had something else that I could do allowed me multiple times in my own ministry to be able to stand up and do the hard choice that I might have otherwise been afraid if it meant it was going to be, the consequences of that decision might mean that I wouldn't be able to feed my family or to pursue the career that I had trained for. But knowing that I had that, I had an option. So let me just say that right in the beginning so we get that clear. But how does this work out? What is it that you feel so strongly about that you're willing to give up things for? That you're willing to give up something that you hold very dear for? A long time ago, more than 15 years ago now, because of my manifold sins and wickedness, I was appointed the first president of the Standing Commission on Communication in the Episcopal Church. We were the bloggers, the army of bloggers and website people who were doing that internet thingy that Presiding Bishop Frank Griswold didn't particularly like. The thing about the internet in the very beginning was it was a shift in the way information got out to people. Prior to that, you let people know, as bishop, what you wanted them to know when you wanted them to know it. And by being able to control the flow of information that way, you could get people to do the things that you wanted them to do. But the internet started breaking stories early, started letting information out, started sharing what was going on with a lot of people, and people didn't expect that. There was some pushback, a lot of pushback in the broader church and in the leadership of the church. It wasn't unique to the Episcopal Church. It was lots of places. It's been in lots of different fields. And at the time, we really didn't have a website even for the Episcopal Church. There was a web page at MIT that somebody had put up because the Episcopal Church just wasn't interested in having a website. We were embarrassed. So a group of us got ourselves commissioned by General Convention, and as I said, I got to be the president. As a young priest, I was very proud of that. I was the president of a standing commission. People knew me all of a sudden. And so we started our work. Our work was not welcomed. It really was not welcomed. And it came to a point of conflict at a meeting where one of the members of our commission had stood up and said something and had been totally rejected. And we realized that we had no ability to speak. if people weren't going to listen to us. And so we talked to one another. And the person who had been rejected said, I quit. I am out of this. I just don't want to be a part of it anymore. And I said, wait, you don't get to quit. I'm quitting first. Because that's really the only power I had, was the power of resignation. I could resign it in a very public way, and people would notice that I made that decision. I simply couldn't go on in this way. The moment I said that, our ability, and we're a fractious group, our ability to work together changed. Because I said, I'll give up this thing that obviously matters to me, because what matters more to me is that the Episcopal Church finds the effective way to proclaim the gospel to the world. And all of a sudden, things got better. We managed to work together in a much more homogeneous way. We managed to convince the Episcopal Church to start fixing the website that they had up, and today, it's really not that bad. In fact, at General Convention this summer, I'm on the legislative committee that is going to vote, I expect, to dissolve the Standing Commission. They're resigning, but they're resigning now for a completely different reason. They're not resigning because no one's listening to them. They're resigning because everyone did listen to them, and they really don't need to be working anymore. See how that works? If you're willing to give up something that you hold very dear, people will notice. And by doing that, you can draw people to a shared goal, and you can move them in a direction. Now that's a simple story from my own background. There are much more powerful images. Have you seen the movie Selma? Have you seen the movie Selma that is retelling the civil rights movement as that great pivotal moment in the civil rights led by Martin Luther King Jr. happens in the town of Selma as they cross the bridge. And on one side of the bridge are the police and guard dogs, and on the other side are the African American people, the Negro people, who were feeling they did not have the right to vote. And they had to choose whether or not they were going to cross that bridge. They'd been told they had 3 minutes to disperse and go back to their homes and churches. What were they going to do? Martin Luther King Jr.'s nonviolent campaign, I'm reading from a quote here, illustrates what Jesus is saying. And the white powers that be turned the hoses and dogs on the marchers, and those images were splashed across television. The reality of our racism was graphically and publicly exposed for all to see. King knew exactly what he was doing. Let them get their dogs, he shouted, and let them get the hose, and we will leave them standing before their God and the world, spattered with the blood and reeking with the stench of their Negro brothers. It is necessary, he continued, to bring these issues to the surface, to bring them out into the open where everyone can see them. As we know, King was to some degree successful. Once exposed, the spirit of racism began to lose some of its power over many people. He was willing to march to a place where he knew he would be hurt. But by so doing, he exposed the irrational anger that people had in that moment. Why did Jesus die? Well, in the simplest way, Jesus died because there was great conflict between the secular authorities, the Romans, and the religious authorities in Israel. Herod and the high priests and Pontius Pilate and the Roman legions were fighting. Ultimately, that fight, which was going to be about a century long, was going to end with the complete and total destruction of Jerusalem. It ended with tens of thousands of Jewish people crucified. But in that moment, they thought perhaps by killing Jesus, they could find a way to paper over the differences they had. You step back and you just look at the historical record. That's what's happening. By crucifying Jesus, we see that we have killed God. By killing God and by the extraordinary, surprising response that God had of resurrection, of new life, of the beginning of the reign of God, our anger and irrational behavior is exposed, and we begin to see who we really are and that God still loves us in spite of it. And God is still asking us to enter by forgiveness, by the water of baptism, by the sacraments of confirmation, by the sacraments of Eucharist, by the sacraments of reconciliation and reaffirmation, back into a relationship with God. It's really important. This is a reminder of what we are capable of. That is a reminder that God can overcome all of that, and that we can be invited into a new way of living with God. That's what John is saying so many different ways in his gospel. A light shines in the darkness, and the darkness cannot overcome it. It is necessary that the Son of Man be lifted up, so that all the world can be drawn to him. And all the world being drawn to him, the world can be saved. That's the story of Lent. It's the story of Holy Week. It's the story of Easter. It's what we celebrate week in and week out at that altar. Listen, we tell the story every single week because it's so important that we understand what we are capable of and what we can become by God's grace and because of God's love. Next week, when you sit here on Palm Sunday and you hear the Passion liturgy read aloud and you hear that language, listen carefully and see if in it you can find that image of what God is doing in that moment, that horrible moment of God's death. And on Easter, listen carefully and see how God has overcome death and given us the ability to have new life, invited us into a new way of being a people, invited us into a new way of being a community gathered around the foot of the cross. If you can, be present all through the Triduum, all through Maundy Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter itself, listening and remembering who you are, whose you are, and that in spite of it all, God adores you, loves you, and is inviting you into a life that is extraordinary. You have everything you need because God has given it to you, because God loves you. You have that backup plan I was talking about. The most important thing is settled. You have new life. You have life eternal because of your relationship with God. What have you to be afraid of? Amen.
Amen.